Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninja speaking. This particular video is going to be dedicated to pretty much the kind of toolbox that I've assembled for myself over time of a bunch of different tools and various odds and ends that I've used for not just fixing bootleg figures but also more customization and a little more odds and ends that might not be quite so obvious. So in this particular case, for the items that I still have links for, I will be providing links for either purchase, probably a lot of Amazon stuff in this case, or at least good suggestions for alternatives if I can't find them at this point. Now this first group of tools is mostly related to kind of more basic repairs, aka helping to separate things as well as cleaning up flashing issues, so basically casting issues that we find in a lot of our bootlegs. So starting off, we have some more kind of needle nose pliers on here. These are a little more meant for kind of either help putting things into place or separating more delicate objects. Although as you can kind of tell from the edges on there, I tend to be a little more rough with these ones, unfortunately, because the metal is a little on the soft side, if I'm being totally honest. But generally they're kind of good for pulling things apart that are a little more delicate, as opposed to the needle nose pliers, which we're going to get to in a second. Here we go. Now this is a more set of standard pliers on here when you need to exert a little more force than the little ones can apply. And you only really want to use that if you really need the force or kind of really need to push something in. Now here's another hobby standard. That's your standard X-Acto knife. Comes in all sort of station sizes, but generally what you're looking for is something with a nice kind of easy to grip handle on that one, good sharp blade, and something that's going to be interchangeable. Speaking of another hobby standard, hobby nippers in this case. This is one you want to use when you need to cut off kind of excess plastic on the edges here. Mostly your flash and stuff can kind of get a nice flush finish on there. Comes in a bunch of different shapes and sizes. This one's kind of a broader set in this case. God, this part is a hobby kit, but you can find much thinner profile ones for kind of more tighter quarters. Now the next one I'm going to show you kind of the in-package version, because I got a bunch of these. These are a bunch of sanding sticks that I happen to usually pick up off of Amazon. Good for dry sanding, also wet sanding for that matter. And they come in a bunch of different grits for the various sticks, so you can kind of go from a more coarse end to kind of working your way up to more fine finishes in this case, so you can really get a nice smooth finish. I don't tend to do a lot of wet sanding, which is actually something I really should improve on. So you can kind of see these do tend to fill up every little bit, or after quite a few usages. So you will need to replace them eventually, but that's the reason why they're pretty disposable anyway. And they're fairly cheap to pick up, to be quite honest. So yeah, it's good to have a couple of sets of these handy. So I definitely do have a little small stash of them that I do keep in my personal office. And speaking of sanding, these ones are pretty much nice diamond files in this case. Once again, you can do this either dry or wet sanding. Nice metallic tools, have a nice little weight to them, and come with a bunch of different edges and kind of ends on there, so you can really get in the nooks and crannies of various bits. Good for cleaning up edges, or actually openings for joint openings, I find in this case, as well as just general good kind of sanding purposes for sculpture work. So really a lot of uses I get out of these ones. Now when I need to start reattaching things that are kind of either broken apart or just kind of loose, that's when I start pulling out my different glue sets. Now the page for Superglue for plastics here is something that I really only use for when I have something that's a little more flush or flat in order to attach, because that's only really works well if you happen to have something where you can brush the markers on both ends and let it dry, then put the glue together in order to kind of press it together. Fortunately, it doesn't work well for tight corners or rounded spots. For that kind of stuff, that's when I start pulling out the Bob Smith Industry stuff, which you can see I have both the Insta-Cure and the Maxi-Cure kind of parts of the set here. Now the Maxi-Cure is kind of more generalist one because it's a little more on the runny end. Does work well for attaching things together, but I find it's actually really useful for tightening up joints in this case, or kind of applying stuff on a joint that is loose for like a rounded one that you need to pop in and out. Whereas the Insta-Cure is the one I use when I need to really fill in some gaps, just because it's a bit of a thicker consistency on that one. Both are very useful though, but especially when you start using the Insta-Set Accelerator. And how that works is basically you spray it either on the surface or while the thing's drying, and it pretty much acts as a kicker. Really speeds up the drying process even faster to almost instantaneous, quite frankly. Now the last bit you kind of see here is actually terrible for toys. In this case, the Uncure will actually melt quite a few of the different plastics used by them. So really it's more of an insurance policy purchase in case you happen to get your glue in your hands and get yourself stuck in some fashion, in order to soften the glue enough to safely separate your skin without ripping too much. Because trust me, that hurts. And now we're moving on to the part of the program where these are the tools I tend to pull out when stuff starts going really south and I need to start drilling holes in stuff in order to either remake pins or change the size of openings. So now for the first one bit is more of a general utility one, and that's kind of a more manual pin vise, as well as a bunch of different little drill bits that I've got as part of the set, I believe, when I picked up the drill vise. Now, generally speaking, a lot of these will be smaller than honestly anything you need to use, but it's still good to have around, and you can use it kind of fix a bunch of different things. Now, this little middle bit here is kind of a pin vise, and it's honestly one of the most useful things I have in my toolbox for kind of holding stuff together when I'm either trying to drill into it or glue stuff together and kind of keep it in place. That way you can focus on where you're trying to either glue or drill without trying to fuss and trying to keep it balanced in your hand at the same time. So I cannot stress enough how much of a good purchase that is. And the last one here is another set of kind of drills, but this is more of a hobbyist set in this case. As you can see, literally Mr. Hobby on the front. And it's more of a convenience purpose just because it has these big thick handles on it, color coded so you can tell exactly what size is what, and it just so happens to match the sizes that I tend to use most often anyway. Now we're going to look at some of the oddball tools that I've used in my fixing endeavors, and that's going to start with this little hammer here, as well as what you can see is a very beat up dental tool with flattened edges. In case you're wondering what I use it for, it's for one very specific purpose, and that's removing the metal pins from SH figure arts joints. In case you're wondering how that works, basically I put whatever I need to hammer out in the pin vise there, and I use this to gradually nudge out the metal pin as I need to, or put it back in once I'm done fixing whatever I needed to fix it with. The next oddball tool is actually meant for a kind of different hobbyist usage, and that's this embossing gun that I have here. For those that are not familiar with what that is, it's basically kind of a more fine point heat gun in this case, which you can use in order to either mess with very stubborn joints, if you're very careful about it, or just kind of reheat and reshape plastic. That being said, this can get plastic very hot if you hold it on the spot too long and accidentally melt it, so just be very careful in its usage. And the last bit on this one, technically these aren't tools, these are more empty cups, kind of mixing cups, measuring cups, and you're about to see in a second a margarine container that I use very often, and basically what you really want to use this is kind of the whole joints and bits as you're separating our figures. Or in this case for the plastic tub, I actually filled it up with hot water and let figures soak in that thing in order to soften up the joints for better separating, which is always good to have handy. Last thing here, of course, being a bunch of gloves. Generally, I always recommend wearing gloves, especially doing with super glues, paints, and everything, just to save your fingers. So it's good protection overall. Now we're going to get for more general sculpting as well as customizing materials here. And for that, my general material choice tends to be epoxy sculpt, which is a two-part epoxy. Basically, you mix in equal parts A and B, you have quite a few hours working time, and it dries really hard after 24 hours. And for blending that stuff, I tend to use the intended safety solvent that they happen to sell in this case. And while you can use water as a substitute for this one, just be careful the amount of water you use, because I find it can make the surfaces, if you use too much, a little kind of grainy and makes it a little harder for sanding later. Speaking of stuff you can sand in there, the Tamiya putty is something I tend to use for filling in little gaps or kind of rounding off edges. Comes in a tube, comes in kind of a sticky kind of putty substance, but tends to dry in really well and takes very well to sanding and painting at the end there. So it's kind of good for spot fixes of sorts. Now for the next little bit, you see me with a bunch of different metallic tools here, and these are for more general sculpting. And as you can see from each one is almost every one of them is double-ended, and because of the different finishes there, you can use them in order to use a bunch of different techniques to kind of fix in folds, flatten stuff out, round out edges, you name it, you can probably do it with the set here. And these always tend to come in a very kind of wide variety of sets, very easy to find on Amazon. Our next set of tools are actually silicone based on one end, and what makes that useful is because the silicone doesn't tend to stick to the epoxy as much. They're much easier to clean, I find, as well as they tend to leave smoother markings and finishes as you're kind of scraping along the material. The other end are kind of more simple dotted figures, kind of useful for certain finishes, but not as useful, I find. And you kind of see there are more heavy-handed dotted tools in this case, which are big, heavy round spheres on both ends. They don't seem immediately useful, but what I would find when I notice it, the openings or the sizes of some of those bowls actually match really well with a bunch of different joints that tend to be used by both figure arts as well as some Revoltech figure. So if you're trying to recreate the openings on that on a new sculpt or trying to fix something on an old one, you can use those as reference points in order to kind of really work them in there. So that is still good to have handy, I find. Our last part in this showcase is a bunch of different size stainless steel rods in this case. And honestly, these only come into play when you have something that has either a peg or a post that's so broken, you just have to outright replace it. So that's what I've been using on some of my fixes as of late. As a small thank you for anyone who stuck to the video at this point, here's a sneak peek on things to come, as well as a little layout of the next upcoming videos I have in mind. Just to give a gist on thing, unfortunately the international shipping situation out of China has become intermittent again in this case. So while I'm having a bit of a dearth in terms of being able to get new bootleg stuff, that's not to say I don't have videos in mind. So namely, we're going to be starting off with getting the second armor kit from One Studios finally assembled and painted, so that's what you're kind of seeing here, the part 1 of. But we're also going to get the Kudabayuka kits assembled, because I do have a number of them behind me, got them before shipping from the States got to be a bit of a slowdown, as well as a bit of custom work that we're going to be talking in the near future. But that's going to be then. For now though, thank you all for watching, and catch you all soon.